But this evening, I'm going to take you into a rather arcane world of World Heritage Sites. If you think this is all to do with the best in the world, you're wrong. There's a lot of politics behind what happens with a World Heritage, in order to create a World Heritage Site. And in fact, when the Antonine Wall became one of the decisions made at that occasion related to one of the Angkor Wat sites, temple sites, which actually was in the next door country, but owned by Cambodia. And the outfall of that decision led to the resignation of the Thailand foreign minister. That's just to give you an idea that there's a lot of politics go on behind the creation of a World Heritage Site. In 1984, the UK government signed the Convention for World Heritage Sites and started nominating obvious ones like Stonehenge and the Tower of London. And then the first tranche was Hadrian's Wall, 1987. And this was the only World Heritage Site that a Roman fort, Roman frontier, which was a World Heritage Site at that time. But about 10 years later, a German colleague started saying, well, this is 130 kilometers long. The frontier in Germany is 550 kilometers long. Don't you think that also should be a World Heritage Site? And indeed, this became a World Heritage Site in due course in 2005. And the straight line cutting right the way from top to bottom across this map is what survives throughout most of its length as the World Heritage Site, is certainly a very distinctive feature in the landscape. 3 years later, the Antonine Wall, seen here at Bonnybridge, between Bonnybridge and Falkirk, became a World Heritage Site as well. And therefore, the three land frontiers, Antonine Wall, Hadrian's Wall, and the frontier from here round to the Danube about there, became World Heritage Sites. And we realised at the time, in those the discussions actually took place exactly 20 years ago at a conference which fortuitously had the appropriate movers and shakers at it. We realised, well, okay, if Germany goes forward, the Netherlands perhaps, certainly Austria, here, Hungary, Romania with good frontiers, and then you're moving on to the rest of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. And indeed, that is exactly what has happened. At the moment, we have those three sites I mentioned, Lower Germany, which is in Germany itself, and the Netherlands, became a World Heritage Site this summer, as indeed the frontier in this section of the Danube. And proposals are in place for the rest of the Danube frontier and Dacia here, as well as Hungary. And we have this year, even this year, it's so difficult, new discussions have opened up with colleagues in North Africa and the Middle East. So we're looking at possibly a complex of World Heritage Sites, a cluster now called, which embraces all the frontiers of the Roman Empire, something like 7,500 kilometers and more. But coming back to the Antonine Wall, this is you're looking at the document, cluster of documents, in fact, which were presented to UNESCO and were approved by the World Heritage Committee as the appropriate nomination documentation for the Antonine Wall becoming a World Heritage Site. So this is what we had to produce. We've got the document, this is the document itself, the nomination, the management plan, 59 maps enshrined here, all CDs, and all in this nice sort of like IKEA box. So how did we get there? Well, First of all, just to remind you, we're somewhere around here, and to the north of us is the Antonine Wall, running from the Forth to the Clyde. And along it are a series of forts. Just to pause on this, actually, one of the first issues for us was, what do we want to nominate? I mean, and we came down very firmly in favour of just the Antonine Wall itself, because everybody understood that. It had a beginning and an end, if you see what I mean. It also had 5 local authorities looking after it. And if we went beyond that, we would be faced with sites over here which are visible, Arduk as well, possibly other sites where there are visible remains, and we'd end up in a much more complex series of issues with 7 or 8 local authorities to work with, and indeed an open sore almost, because other authorities will come forward and say, oh, well, what about our site? So we restricted it to just the Antonine Wall itself. And here it is, running from modern Carridon at Bowness here, through to ending just under the bridge at O'Kilpatrick. Along it are forts, as you can see, and it's in a really tremendous landscape, I think. Here we are, we're looking north from the Antonine Wall, or rather northwest, across the Rift Valley of Scotland to the Campsie Hills to the right, the Kilpatrick Hills to the left. And you see the excellent position where the Antonine Wall was constructed. It's still an interesting landscape today. That last photograph was obviously taken in the summer. This is in the winter. And even today, that ground in between the ridge on which the Antonine Wall sits and the Campsie Fells to the north floods very easily. And it's almost as if it's an extra defence for the Romans. But the wall itself is still very visible in this stretch of the landscape. I was standing to take the photographs more or less at the bottom of the slide, but looking to the left. And here you can see across the landscape very clearly the line of the Antonine Wall. So one of the first issues you have to deal with if you want to make your site, property, monument, call it what you will, a World Heritage Site, you have to have something to show. And here we have clearly something to show. And we have more than that. This is the fort at Rough Castle, now earthworks, but very visible earthworks, with a fort to the left and a large annex to the right. These forts are linked by a road, still visible in stretches such as this, at Seabegs Wood, with even the ditches on each side of the road visible. At various locations along the wall were smaller fortified enclosures, which we call fortlets, a sort of small fort, if you like. This is the most visible one at Kinneil, just beside Bowness. And you can see the road leading out on the north side and the posts on one side of the gate, and posts inside the enclosure itself where the soldiers would have lived, excavated and laid out for display. We have interesting features as well. At Rough Castle, the northern side of the fort was defended by this series of interlocking pits in which there would have been a stake and covered with branches, so not seen by an invader. Bruce used the same technique at Bannockburn. We also have small features which we don't altogether understand. So we're looking westwards here. The background is blurred, but that's the line of the wall running up to Castle Hill. And here is the wall itself, surviving as simply a bump. And to the south of it, there's an extra mound attached to the back of the wall. These are not known on any other Roman frontier. We need a few unique elements if we want to win our nomination. And here we have at the very bottom what we've been looking at, 5 and 6, one of those mounds. And to the top, we've got another stretch at Rough Castle where we have 2 mounds on each side of the fort. These may be to do with signalling. It's not clear. It's just one of the intriguing issues still surrounding the wall which we don't understand. And as an archaeologist, let me tell you, you're out of a job if you can understand everything. We also have, and this is unique on Roman frontiers, the evidence for the camps in which the soldiers lived and possibly stored their materials and equipment and weapons and so on. We have a series of these along the wall which enable us to understand something about the division of work in building the frontier. So you can see here the ditch of a camp. There's a gate there, gap in the darkness, and that another gate here, and the dark line is the ditch where, because it's deeper, the water collects in it more than the surrounding ground, and therefore the vegetation at certain times of the year grows differentially. So we can pick up, if we're flying at the right times of the year, features such as this, a labour camp constructed by the soldiers working on the wall. They also marked out the stretches of wall they built. This is again a unique element of the Antonine Wall. Here we're looking at the last distance slab. We call them distance slabs, incidentally, because they record this here, right at the bottom, the distance of wall that this legion, which is a detachment vexillatio detachment of Legion 20 Valeria Victories, the length of wall constructed by that legion. And as I say, these are unique to the Antonine Wall. They record across the top the titles of the emperor, Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius Pater Patriae, occupies most of this, the wording. And right at the very bottom, we've simply got the name of the legion and the amount constructed. But in the middle, we've got these wonderful scenes. In this case, we've got the goddess, probably Victory, though there's some discussion about that, putting, as you can see, a small laurel wreath in the beak of the legion's eagle, held up by the aquilifer, the eagle bearer, watched by 2 kneeling, bound, captive barbarians. It's an incredible evocation of the battle that's just taken place. The score was 1 to the Romans, 0 to the Caledonians. And the Romans celebrated their victory by erecting these distance slabs. Now, if you want to put these into context, this is one from Hadrian's Wall, which records building by soldiers on Hadrian's Wall. What we've got here is a reverse C, which stands for the centurion, the century of, and then it's Granius. And that's the best we can do on Hadrian's Wall. Very simple markers. The German frontier is no better. Well, very little better anyway. We've got a few more letters on it telling us what happened, but nothing at all like the Antonine Wall distance slabs. So that's a very great plus. Having said that, one of the ironies is that because the distance slabs have been found and this inscription and taken into a museum, it's not a World Heritage Site. The World Heritage Site is the Antonine Wall, defined, as we'll see in a moment, by maps. The material that comes from it, which helps us understand how it worked, how the soldiers lived, what they did with their time, all of that material goes into a museum, and that isn't and can't be a World Heritage Site, technically because all the material in it is movable somewhere else. It's a bit of an out-of-date concept. What we also have to do to demonstrate that the Antonine Wall was worth becoming a World Heritage Site is that we knew a lot about it. Excavation started in the 1890s on the Antonine Wall, collecting of inscriptions such as distance slabs, back in the 17th century. And I'm just illustrating one excavation by Sir George MacDonald and A.O. Curl in 1920s at Mumrills, which is next door to Falkirk, and this is from the excavation report, recording the outline of the fort, the ditches and the interior buildings. And our documentation, which you've seen the cover of, is full of plans such as this, to demonstrate that we have a lot of knowledge about this frontier, when it was occupied and who occupied it and so on. We have some sections through the Antonine Wall which tell us quite a lot about how it's constructed. You can see the tiger stripes. The black here is the grass, and the orangey bits are the soil. So the wall was actually built not with the grass up, but with the grass down, believe it or not. So they put the turf down, grass downwards, and then built on top of that. This was dug by Anne Robertson in the 1950s in advance of a pipeline, which we would not allow today. We'd make them thrust more underneath the wall. You can see the stone base at the bottom, and the height surviving is about 5 feet. It's pretty good. One of the most exciting projects that's taking place at the moment is to understand more about the turf and where it came from, how it was used in building the wall. So watch this space. Hopefully there's going to be an article in the next proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. To bring us more up to date, this is a plan of my own excavations, which took place from 1973 to 82 on the Antonine Wall. Then we found traces of barrack blocks, the headquarters building, granaries, and most importantly, 2 buildings, the bathhouse up here and the latrine there. So what we're also showing to UNESCO is that we don't just have earthworks, we have stone buildings on display, like this bathhouse at Bearsden, where we have the changing room. Soldiers take off their clothes, keep their sandals on because the floor's hot. Central hall, you can have a sauna here, or what we might think of as a steam bath, getting hotter and hotter. The red is to represent the heat of the furnace, and the hot air circulates under the floors here, and that's why you need to keep your sandals on. So we have here an illustration, a reflection of life, of the Roman civilization, of life of Roman soldiers, even here right on the northwest frontier of Rome. And in the shadow top left is the latrine. And we excavated this, and we found the sewage from it. My illustrator, Mike Moore, created this for me. There's not a lot of privacy if you went to the toilet in a Roman world. If you've been to Pompeii or Ostia, you know that. But the wooden seating's gone, the drains all survived, and the soldiers maintain modesty by their tunic. But this diagram is the only one in existence that I know which shows what soldiers are using in place of toilet paper. They're using moss. And how do we know that? Well, it's because we found it in the sewage. We found the sewage which came out of these drains, and the big drain running underneath here, which flowed out into the fort ditch, and we excavated that, and we found also not just what the soldiers cleaned themselves with, but items like this. These are the seeds from figs, which had to be imported from continent, presumably warmer climes, and these have gone through a Roman soldier. As had a lot of other material we found there. We discovered the soldiers used 3 different types of wheat, for example, including Durham wheat, which is used today in pasta and pizzas. They had barley, presumably used in broth, and the barley was contaminated by beetles, unfortunately. They gathered local wild fruits, strawberries, raspberries, bilberries, blackcurrants, yes, nuts, hazelnuts, for example, vegetables like lentils, dill were eaten and possibly brought in. So they had quite a mixed diet. Food was flavoured by coriander, opium poppy as well, such as one might use on certain breads today. And some of this coming from continental Europe, olive oil from Spain, wine from France, and their rather strange fish sauce also from France. So that sounds good. But they also had worms. 2 types of worms were found, and they had fleas, because we found a flea. Only one. But I think that was enough. Must have got there somehow. We learnt a lot too about supply in other ways than food. So we're looking at a group of vessels here that were used at Bear's Den. So top left is a cooking pot, which came from southeast England. Bottom left is a bowl which came from southwest England. Top right, the jar is from what would now be Pas-de-Calais and the Netherlands, that sort of region. And the 2 mixing bowls, one made in the middle at top locally by Sarius, a potter who came with the army to provide for its needs. So we here have quite a group of material which indicates the tentacles stretching out from this Roman fort on the very edge of the Roman Empire. One of the intriguing aspects is this drawing. It's the top part of a brazier, and you can see the nodules sticking up. So if you put a pot on it, say bottom left, the pot you put on it would have a saggy bottom. That's an archaeological technical term, incidentally. And it would have a saggy bottom because it had to sit on top of that brazier and not slip off. And we found three examples of these. But this is cooking in an African style. And during the time the Antonine Wall was being built, soldiers from it, we know that because we have a document which tells us, went to North Africa to fight in a war and presumably came back with new ideas relating to cuisine. Whether the soldiers brought them, whether their wives brought them, whether their slaves brought these ideas back, we do not know. What we do know, however, is we have this amazing link. Of course, as an archaeologist, it's not just good enough to do all that excavation. You have to publish it, you have to put it in archaeological journals or monographs. So one of our pictures, excuse me, in the book, the nomination book, are from Scottish journals, which demonstrate that this material has been published. It's not just modern wordage that we wanted to bring into the discussion. So this coin is of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and we are told by his biographers that under his general Lollius Urbicus, he conducted war in Britain. He drove out the Britons, whatever that means, we're not sure. And he built a new wall, this time of turf, as we have seen. So we have a document actually written, admittedly 200 years after the emperor died, telling us something about the Antonine Wall. He had ordered its construction, what it was made of, and that's obviously a very important piece of evidence. We also have, from the Senate House, which is the brick building in the middle, a later replacement after a fire, we have a fragment of a speech given by presumably the consul of the day. He was certainly a senator. We're not sure if at this moment when he gave the speech he was a consul. And he said, "The emperor, although sitting in his palace in Rome, directed the affairs in Britain like the steersman steers a ship." That's wonderful, isn't it? We have this document. We know where it will be declaimed here, and it's a fragment which survives in Roman literature to this day. We also have inscriptions which bolster our story. The stone at the bottom is all that survives of a very early building stone from the Antonine Wall, recording across the bottom that it was... this fort was built by Quintus Lollius Urbicus, second line up, and then his title, Legatus Augusti Proprietary, which means Governor of Britain. So we know from the history book that Lollius Urbicus was a general in Britain, and here on the wall itself, we've got him recorded. So it ties up and enables us to say in our documentation, we know when the Antonine Wall was built, we know why it was built, we know who built it. But just to make sure, to be honest, you throw everything in that you can think of. So this man is called Edward Gibbon, who wrote one of the most famous books ever, history books ever, and he said, if you were to choose a time in the world to live, it would be between about 100 and 180. And slap in the middle of this is the reign of Antoninus Pius. So we prayed Edward Gibbon in aid. Why not? So moving on to a different aspect of what you have to demonstrate to win this accolade, you have to show that you can look after the monument well. Well, this came out in many pictures, of course, but this one I like. This was two of the Antonine Wall squad taking into care a new bit of the wall near Bonny Bridge, and excuse me, what they're doing is removing the dense vegetation, mostly rhododendron books, in order to create a neat and tidy site for visitors and stop the damage that the roots of trees and rhododendron bushes are doing to the monument. You have to show that you can satisfactorily present to the public the monument itself. This is another view of the bathhouse at Bearsden, which we've already seen, with the information plaque being inspected by no less a person than my father. And here it is, erected at the opening of the monument in 1983, where you can get an idea of the level of information presented to the public about the Antonine Wall, the fort, the bathhouse, what happened, the naming of the rooms, and where else. On the right, you can see the wall. And these have been erected all along the monument itself. Well, it's all very well doing that. You have also to demonstrate there is a commitment to continue. So we're looking at a historic photograph. What we did, we had a reception in Glasgow, and we persuaded the 5 local authorities and the minister at the time, Patricia Ferguson, who's in the foreground sitting, to sign a document saying they will look after the Antonine Wall properly. And that's the document with all the signatures on it. By Joe. This is really important element of the nomination. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you can continue to look after the monument properly. So here was the pledge, not on stone in this case, but parchment. One of the big issues, of course, is defining your monument on a map. Sometimes it might be easy. You could draw a circle around Stonehenge, for example, even though that's not so simple because it's got ancillary elements. But what we had to do was to define the area that we regarded as being the nomination. What we could have done was to do an entirely new exercise to define the monument. If we decided not to do that, we would use our existing areas of protection, which for most of it are the areas which are protected under the Ancient Monuments Act. So the boundary line down here, which moves around a bit for one reason or another, and on the north side is the extent of the area protected under British law. We wanted to show the different levels of preservation. This is quite a difficult issue. You really need 3 levels because you want to say this is visible, this is not visible, we know it's there under the ground, and this is no longer extant, doesn't exist. And so we went for, you can perhaps see, 3 different levels of colour. And we also wanted to differentiate between the orangey upcast mound, the ditch, which is green, the rampart, which is this darkish red, the military way, the road, which is brown, and here, and the forts and structures on it are all yellow. So that sounds good, but there immediately became an issue. Do we depict the wall as it actually is, or do we depict it symbolically? And this produced probably the most discussion, amongst the most discussion of the whole process. If you depict it symbolically as a single width, you're being disingenuous because the ditch, green, and the upcast mound vary in widths. And so you have to come close to the truth. Otherwise, a landowner with some of the Antonine Wall in his garden or fields, for example, would have a thickness as defined by an OS map, and he might have a different thickness as defined by us on these World Heritage maps, and that wouldn't do. So we had to go as close as possible to the truth that we could in our symbols, and it worked. And we were able to do this through excuse me. First of all, through the expert skills of the then Royal Commission on Ancient Monuments of Scotland, and also through their wonderful collection, which the then Royal Commission on the Ancient Historical Monuments of Scotland curated, with many maps like this, defining the Antonine Wall and forming the basis for the maps in the nomination. And we went out in the field to do some more work to just check on issues. That map that we've just looked at had to be fitted into the wider terrain. So here what we see is this sector, that's the Rough Castle Fort, that great bend, and the line of the nomination carrying on. And we had to define buffer zones to protect that monument. And this is probably the most difficult element because it's very subjective. It's the only bit of the nomination document I didn't write personally. I employed a company to tell us what they thought. And we started off with this map. I think it's a wonderful map. It's what you can see from the Antonine Wall. So the darker the brown is, or yellowy brown, the more places along the Antonine Wall you can see that ground from. And not surprisingly, it's the southern slopes of the Campsie Fells. So if you had a tabula rasa, there were no houses there were no factories, there were no roads, there was nothing except the landscape, that's roughly what you go for as the buffer zone. But you can't do that. You've got to be practical. So we, in the end, went for obviously a much narrower buffer zone, still quite substantial, running along the whole of the Antonine Wall from one end to the other, and provided protection for the environs of the wall. As my predecessor memorably said it, what we want is to retain enough land round the wall so we can see why the Roman surveyors put their stakes in these particular spots to create the line of the Antonine Wall. UNESCO is also big on community involvement. How do you demonstrate community involvement? Well, an obvious one, of course, is Antonine Road or Antonine Close or Roman Road. But there is on the Antonine Wall the Roman Bar. Now, isn't that community involvement? So the Roman Bar in Falkirk features in the nomination document. Now, there was a core group that prepared the nomination, did all the thinking, and most of the writing was, as I say, was myself, but we took a lot of advice and a lot of cerebral activity went into this. We had visitors from abroad sometimes, in this case, as well as local colleagues looking at Bar Hill and trying to discuss the boundaries and so on here. We sometimes went to Paris to talk to UNESCO about their views. This group is from Croatia, Germany, Austria, and Hungary. And because we learned from a previous problem. Back in 30, 40 years ago, possibly, Orkney, some monuments in Orkney, like Mays House and Stenestone Circle and the Ringerbroga, were put forward as a World Heritage Site. And nomination document was written much simpler in those days, got as far as Paris, to the World Heritage Centre, and the Orkney archaeologist wrote and said, this won't do, you need more monuments in. And it all collapsed for 20 years. So we were absolutely determined that as far as possible, everybody should know what the plans were. We produced this booklet, again working with the Royal Commission, which went out to every owner and occupier along the Antonine Wall. They were given away at appropriate meetings and conferences. So as far as possible, everybody knew what the plan was. And we, of course, had articles in newspapers. I gave quite a few interviews to the press and radio and television. And just to keep it all bubbling, we had every 6 months an event at which the Minister of Culture appeared. This is Frank McAvity in the Hunterian Museum. This was Patricia Ferguson again, with a group of children launching the educational plan for the Antonine Wall. I've always wondered what the mother of the boy second in from the right in the back row thought when she saw the picture. Can't think you, Jimmy. And we wanted to do more research. And working with international colleagues, we put a nomination into the Directorate of Education and Culture in the EU. And we received a grant of €1 million, just over, for a 3-year project, which was going to do 3 things. And it was run by this group of people. This is Earth Castle at our final meeting, or near final meeting, with colleagues literally from Spain to Romania. So we wanted to do 4 things. On Hadrian's Wall, there had been excellent results from geophysical survey. Bottom left is the square Roman fort at Maryport, and running away from it is a road heading up to top right-hand corner, and running off that road are houses and enclosures. We wanted to find something like this, and I'm afraid we didn't. We did get interesting results. This is just one. This is a lot of useful information about one particular fort, which we didn't know before, at Ochern Davy. But when we looked outside forts like this, we looked for the civil settlements we could see at Maryport. We found nothing at all. So whether they were timber buildings, which we couldn't see, we're having another go now with improved techniques to see if we can find sites, civil sites outside the forts. We set up a website. We produced this map. We got very fed up with maps of the Roman Empire. You open it up and it says, this is the Roman Empire at its greatest extent and the Emperor Trajan in 117. Well, it's true, but it only lasted 3 years. It's not really durable extent. So we put a lot of work, and we're still tweaking this, believe it or not, to produce this map. And it's basically, it's children. Back to politics. You want to secure your grant. We didn't the first time we applied. And one of the things you have to do is involve in some way younger professionals. So what we went for was looking at how we display sites. So this is an ingenious display in modern Slovakia of the gate of a Roman fort, where, as you can see, there's been some rebuilding of the lower levels, and then you get an idea of the size of the gate from the metal frame. This just represents what we were doing in that. And we also created material for display posters about Roman frontiers, generally for display with local exhibitions in museums along the frontier, such as this at Quincum next to Budapest. And we brought this all together in what, for simplicity, we call the purple volume, because its title is The Frontiers of the Roman Empire, the European Dimension of a World Heritage Site, which is a bit of a mouthful. 200 pages, and we scored a coup. We sent, right at the very end, I thought, if we were doing this in this country, we'll get the minister to write the preface. What can we do? So I got in touch with my contact in Brussels, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. Nobody asked for that. Anyway, I got it out of him. I got a forward. I mean, I wrote it. Come on, this is how it's done. Don't you believe what comes out of ministers' mouths? In a lot of cases, it's civil servants who write it. So, and it's actually signed, bottom right. This at the time, in 2008, when we published the book, was unique. Nobody had ever asked for this. You get what you asked for. A document signed by the Director of Education and Culture. And so we came to this. The nomination document pulled all of that together. The maps, which we've seen, the nomination document, how we're going to look after the monument, the management plan, and then we have to have a visitor, an expert to come and look at the frontier with the documentation to make sure we haven't been pulling a fast one. So they sent out the gentleman, believe it or not, in white, Scholt Vichy, who is a very distinguished Roman frontiers archaeologist, and this is the others. The other four of us are the team which took him up in a helicopter to look at the Antonine Wall. There was a reason for the helicopter. Even under the communist regime, Scholt managed to get permission to go up and do a lot of aerial photography in Scotland. What do you do for an aerial photographer? You take him up in a helicopter. And at Quebec in 2008, you can just see the 8, the World Heritage Committee approved our nomination on the Antonine Wall in June or July, I forget now, 2008. The Antonine Wall became the 3rd Roman frontier as a World Heritage Site. That, of course, is not the end. In many ways, it's just the beginning, because you've then got to start delivering on access, on improved parking, on improved notices, and so on. The management of the monument has to carry on. People's expectations are raised, including younger people. So the number of young archaeologist clubs, and this is Jim Devine, who worked very hard with us at the Hunterian Museum, is explaining to a group of young archaeologists in the Hunterian the importance of this distance slab. So expanding, it's a springboard to expand into youth. We were also starting to produce these multi-language books on Roman frontiers. To the left is Hadrian's Wall, and to the right is the Antonine Wall. These now form the ones in German, French and English, and one's just in English and German. And these are now part of a series of something like 14 books. We're heading for 20, hopefully by August next year, which will cover eventually all the frontiers of the Roman Empire in a multiplicity of languages. One of the great and interesting things about getting big grants from bodies like the EU is that if you create something like this and think about selling it, they just deduct it from your grant. So you give them away. And part of our team, who we'll meet in a moment or two, had already started creating videos of the German frontier and Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, and they wanted to get into Eastern Europe and couldn't afford it. And nobody there could afford it. So we came up with the wizard idea of commissioning them to do a DVD. And that got them into Eastern Europe, and they produced a bigger DVD, and we produced 70,000 of these and gave them away to schools. And you can still get hold of them, and you can read it in whichever language you like, more or less, at least 6. And if you get the Arabic version, you can even watch George Findlater in Arabic. Of course, we're now into apps on phones. And here's Eric and Sandra, who are our film team. Some ideas didn't work. A colleague at this museum came up with the idea of twinning museums on frontiers. It sounds a good idea, doesn't it? And we started off with the Bavarian Museum Service, and then the director changed, and he wasn't interested, and it fell apart. So that collapsed. Twinning schools on frontiers also collapsed. In this case, it was a Scottish head teacher, changed, and the new one wasn't interested. But in all of this, one of the most important things is communication. I mean, there are people here from 10 countries across Europe who have been working together to create an entirely new type of World Heritage Site, the frontiers of the Roman Empire, which in UNESCO speak is a serial phase transnational World Heritage Site, which simply means it operates in different countries and it's incremental. And we're well on the way, as I mentioned. Communication and discussion has been very important, which enabled all of us to improve our documentation by talking to colleagues. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was fascinating. I didn't realize the project was as big as that. Quite astounding. My claim to fame with the Antonine Wall is for my 60th birthday, I flew along the Antonine Wall in a microlight. I didn't really know what I was looking at the time, so I'll have to get up again if my wife lets me and check it out once more. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions, and I shall run up and down the stairs. I might not make it all the way to the top in the gallery. So, first question, please.
Thank you for that. That was very interesting. The question is very straightforward. Hadrian's Wall looks like a wall. The Antonine Wall doesn't really look like a wall, and yet it was built, 50 years or so after Hadrian's Wall, I think. Is there a reason for the difference in visual structure?
Yes, a very good question. The Hadrian's Wall being finished off in stone, wasn't originally all built in stone, is a real nuisance because it's unusual. I mean, most Roman forts and frontiers are built in turf and timber first, and as the timber in particular decays, it's replaced in stone. I mean, you can even see that. If you go to the Roman side at Corbridge, you can see that because the gaps in the uprights, where the uprights were in timber, have decayed, and the wall was built round them. The issue is that Hadrian's Wall being built in stone is unusual. And that's what we have to explain. I mean, there is no coyness in the statement that Antoninus Pius, the emperor, built a new wall, or ordered a new wall to be built, this time of turf. I mean, they're not hiding it in any way. And in fact, on Hadrian's Wall, from 0 to wall mile 49, the wall is built of stone, and from 49 to 80, it's built of turf, and then was replaced in stone, which was a normal process. So we have to ask ourselves, why is Hadrian's Wall built in stone, or 50 miles of it? I would say there are basically two arguments put forward. One is that the emperor wanted to make a statement. I want a wall. What kind of wall, sir? Well, a proper wall. Yes, I know, sir, but what kind of wall do you want? Well, what about the wall around Athens? I mean, there's no walls around cities in the Western Empire at this time. Hadrian knew Athens. When he makes his decision, he's probably in the Eastern Empire. And the conversation might have gone on like that. It's made up, but, you know, if you want to understand the Roman Empire, there was a discussion by philosophers with Hadrian present, and he went to bed early, and one of the philosophers turned to another and said, "He was wrong, you know. Why didn't you correct him? One doesn't argue with a man with 30 legions at his back." What the emperor wanted, the emperor got. So one reason possibly is he wanted, if you like, a proper wall. And the proper walls he knew were Greek city walls. The other is possibly much more mundane, it's materials. So if you go to the west of Scotland today, it's wetter. West of England, it's wetter. There's more turf. In the central section of the wall, you find some turf. And if you've been to Housestead, the rocks here, right under your feet. There's no turf to speak of. So you haven't got turf, and you haven't got much in the way of timber by this time to build a timber fence like they had in Germany, because by about 500 BC, we know from pollen analysis, most of the timber had gone, and we're left with a landscape looking pretty much like today with 10% tree coverage. I mean, we could argue percentages, but that's roughly the picture. So there isn't a lot of timber, but stone is plentiful. So it might be as mundane as that. They built Hadrian's Wall, 50 miles of it, in stone, because stone was there.
Indeed, I was going to ask you whether you could tell us a bit more about the wall itself in terms of how long did it take to build, how was it manned, tell us a bit more about the wall itself, if you can, please.
Yeah. How was it planned? We can answer this. There's a lot of work being done by a chap called John Poulter, who's written a couple of books on this, about surveying Roman roads and the Antonine Wall and Hadrian's Wall. With Hadrian's Wall, just as an aside, Hadrian's Wall was built in front of an existing line of forts, and that affected its position. With the Antonine Wall, it's sort of built completely new in the landscape. And they seem to have set out with the idea they would go for where they wanted to put their forts and small enclosures, the fortlets. And we can see this because in certain places you have the fort and the wall comes up to it like that, as if the fort's there first and the wall comes up to each side, but at an angle. And sometimes the fort is built and then the Antonine Wall is butted up against the sides. So they go to place the forts in the most advantageous position in the landscape, and then they join it up. So the surveyors, and the army had surveyors in their ranks, would mark out the position of the forts in some way. And then a calculation would be done on the length of turf wall being constructed by each legion. This is not an exercise on the back of an envelope. Some of the measurements come down to within a foot along a wall which is 40 Roman miles long, 3,666 and 4/5 of a pace long, which is 3 miles 666 feet and another foot, 7. Because a Roman pace is 5 feet, but a Roman pace is not that. A Roman pace is that. So you bring your back foot forward again. So it's 5 feet. So they're measuring down to a foot along the whole length and parceling it out amongst the legions. So that's the next stage. The interesting thing about Roman frontiers and British frontiers in particular is we can see they kept changing their minds. So we've got 2 forts which have stone walls and one where the inscription comes from, which I showed you earlier on, which has a little wing wall at each side at the front where the wall should have attached to it. And it suggests that the original idea was to build it all in stone, and they changed their mind very quickly, that is. There was manoeuvrability once the plan had been created. That's what I'm trying to say. The building process and how long did it take? We know that it was built by legionaries because we have all these distance slabs stating that. And this was normal. They were the big units, 5,000 strong, with a lot of craftsmen in them. I mean, we have inscriptions which record they had surveyors, levelers for water in surveying. They had carpenters, masons, and even glaziers in the Roman army. Inscriptions survive stating that. So how long did it take? This is the big question, and we don't know. And it's an important question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it leads directly to what the purpose of a Roman frontier was. So if you're scared stiff of the people out there and you want to defend yourself, you build it as quickly as possible. And all the evidence we've got is whether we're in Britain building Hadrian's Wall. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that Hadrian's Wall was not actually finished when Hadrian died. Whether in Germany, where we know now from dendrochronology that the frontier there took 6 years at least to build, because we have dates throughout these. The road running along the frontier, on the eastern frontier, took 7 years to build. So John Horsley in 1732 said the Roman Hadrian's Wall, he was meaning, but any frontier is not built in the face of an enemy there who's threatening you. You get rid of your enemy, and then you build a wall, and you build it at leisure. What the distance slabs help to show us is that we have stones which record 3,666 and a half and 3,666 and 4/5. There are 3 legions working. If you assume that it's not an assumption, sorry. If you take these stones and add them all up together and interpolate the missing stone or 2, it comes to 20 miles. And the Roman Antonine Wall is 40 miles long. So that's what they're doing. They've sorted out, possibly in one season, to build 20 miles, possibly 2. And then we've got the eastern end, which has a totally different measurements, 4,650 paces in one inscription, and the west end, 4 miles, which is measured again entirely differently. So we might be looking at 3, possibly 4 years, in theory. But plans changed, so it might have taken longer. But it's a good question, because it helps us understand that the Antonine Wall isn't a rushed job because the Roman army is under threat.
Was the Antonine Wall, in military terms, a success? And does it also have a function of possibly being a tax barrier, a barrier for trade to stop money and goods drifting one way and another? Was
it a success is a very difficult question to answer, because it lasted about 20 years and then they withdrew to Hadrian's Wall, and it's very possible it's nothing to do with what's happening in Britain, but there was problems on the German frontier at that time, and we know that troops went from Britain to Germany. So it might just be they pulled their horns in because they needed troops elsewhere and they moved back to Hadrian's Wall. In 1974, I did, a long time ago, isn't it? I did a television series with Magnus Magnusson, and we got to O'Kilpatrick, and he was talking about the Antonine Wall being a defence tactic and so on. And my answer was, yeah, well, come on, let's all think, are our defence tactics successful? How do we judge it? We've lived through Blue Streak, the rocket range at Spade Adam, TSR-2, F-111, and those are the only ones I can think of. And they last, how many years? 10, if we're lucky. And then we've got something else. If we start thinking in those terms, it's very difficult to say, was the Antonine Wall a success? Foreign policy changed, that's all. I mean, we could have a good argument about this, I fully admit. And what was your second part? Trade. Yeah, trade's very difficult. We have goods from beyond the empire in Britain and the continent. The big trading area is the east, where stuff is coming in from India, even China, certainly as far away as India. Goods are coming into the empire to the extent that there is a trade deficit, which some Romans invade against. But elsewhere, there's not a lot of evidence. In fact, there are times when the frontier appears to be closed, so there will be no trade. And we do have Roman objects, of course, beyond the empire, but just pause and think. Is this trade? Are they diplomatic gifts? Are they booty from invasions of the province? Were they missionaries of either Roman pagans or later Christians bringing goods? We know that under Domitian, a man called Demetrius sailed to the place where there are lots of islands in Britain as an exploratory voyage. So we've got exploration as well. So there are lots of reasons why there could be Roman goods beyond the frontier. The bottom line is we simply do not have a lot of evidence for trade as such in Britain on the frontiers.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. I wanted to just follow up on your comment about getting rid of the natives and then building the wall with time to spare. If I remember correctly, there's some evidence for depopulation in native settlements as a result or around the effect of Hadrian's Wall, and perhaps some would say this led to some degree of more centralization further north, rather larger powers. And I wonder whether the Antonine Wall might reflect the geopolitics as they're developing. What you might think about that?
Yeah, the big political answer I would offer you is that I like modern comparisons. We fought a war in the Falklands. Why was there a war? I would argue that it is because General Galtieri wanted to take the eyes of his people off what was happening domestically by having a foreign venture. It's very common. I'm reading a wonderful book at the moment called Divided. I would thoroughly recommend it. It explains why China is waving the sword at Taiwan. It's because of the internal divisions, and it's to try to keep the company together by creating an external force. What does Antoninus Pius do when he becomes emperor? The very first thing he does, as far as we can see, within months, is to decide to move back into southern Scotland. I think this is just a political gesture. He never served in the army, he had no military experience, he'd only once been outside of Italy, so far as we know, which was to have the absolute sinecure post of governor of Asia for 3 years. But he needed a triumph. As Suetonius said it about Claudius. He needed a triumph. Britain was the easy place to get it. Southern Scotland had been under Roman surveillance for 50, 60 years already. They would know if there was going to be any problem. Germany's too vast. There's Sahara Desert in the south, and in the east you've got other kingdoms. not sensible to go there. So Britain's the easy option. Now, I firmly believe that. The discussion about depopulation has a very long history, of course. And it's been given new impetus by big excavations on the Northumbrian plain north of Newcastle, where we can see, it would appear, one has to be a little cautious, that sometime in perhaps about the year 100, or a little after when Hadrian's Wall was being built, the agricultural landscape changes from intensive agriculture to something more approaching ranching. And one argument is that this is people being displaced from in front of the Hadrian's Wall and clearing space to the north. But it could simply be that what it's down to is the people to the north are changing their agricultural practices to sell food and leather. I mean, a Roman tent requires 38 goat skins. That's an awful lot of goats. And an awful lot of tents are required. So enormous quantities of material is required by the Roman army. And you're not telling me that the locals wouldn't have seen the advantage. The other absolute thing is what I would like you to take away from you is the idea of this is Hadrian's Wall, this is the Romans, these are whatever, the local population beyond, and they don't mix. They are mixed all the time. And what's increasingly clear is that along Hadrian's Wall, and we've got 4 or 5 places now, we've got actual civil settlements to the north of the wall. You know, the idea that it was a division in this strong, meaningful way, that there was no intermixing, is utterly wrong. So for me, what might happen in the way of clearance that we can see and changes in the landscape might be more to do with people wanting to sell produce of one kind or another to the Romans. And that's where I'm going at the moment anyway.
Can I ask about the people? What about the officers? What about the soldiers? How did they manage so far away from home?
Well, it depends what you call home. You've got to separate out the officers and the soldiers. So the officers were what we would call aristocracy, or if you go back 100 years or so, the squirearchy, term the lairds, if you like, who are... I mean, there's something very 18th century about the Roman Empire. If you were born in the right social class, you could command in war and peace. It's a wonder they didn't lose more armies that way. But it was the upper class who were the officers and the governors of provinces. And what's interesting about Lollius Urbicus, he must have been a very clever man, because the Roman Empire was also very hierarchical, and he was a second son, and yet succeeded getting right to the pinnacle of power, short of the emperor in Rome. So he was a very clever man who was up here at the time. The soldiers originally obviously started out, in Rome, and then the people of Italy got thought they were a bit too grand to serve in the army. So the provinces round there, like southern France, Spain, North Africa, then in that time of Augustus started providing most of the troops. By the time the army got to Britain, the norm was local recruitment. I mean, it was very different from our army. I mean, the Durham Light Infantry, as I knew it, was recruited from Durham and so on, Cameronians and so on, in Scotland. So the Roman army is very different. It recruited locally. So as a soldier dies on the Antonine Wall, called Nectar Vellius, buried at Mumrills, and he was a Brigantian from northern England. Absolutely normal. So they'd be used to the climate. When Agricola came to fight Mons Graupius in 83, just exactly 40 years after the conquest, in 43, Tacitus said he even had loyal Britons in his army, a reflection of recruiting locally. So you do get some others coming in from Gaul and Germany all the time, but the core of the army appears to be recruited locally, and from the sons of soldiers often.
I think you've covered an awful lot tonight. It's an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just can't imagine the time and effort you put into the research and the writing and the chasing down getting the award. So I think we should give our thanks to Professor Breeze.